perpetrators are held to account.
He is absolutely right to ask us to condemn secular violence. The Prime Minister did it yesterday when he addressed the House. I did it in my statement, and it's been done from the opposition front bench as well. And he is also right in saying that violence in the West Bank has reached unprecedented levels, and we are doing everything we can to urge restraint and to ensure that that stops. And in what he said about children, he speaks for the whole House. The analysis of the problem is the easy part, but we are all working for the resolution.
Robin Walker.
On that point of children, I welcome both the statements from the front bench. My honourable friend is right to focus on every civilian life that has been lost in this conflict, and the honourable lady opposite was right to highlight the importance of children in this. I'd remind the House that the full wording of the Balfour Declaration included the words, "it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done but may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." Children's rights should be at the heart of that, and so therefore can I urge my right honourable friend to double down on the push for humanitarian pauses, on the push for humanitarian access to make sure we can protect children's right to life and right to education.
Minister.
I thank him very much for his comments, with which I entirely agree, and also with his recollection of the Balfour Declaration.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
I am told by the Muslim Council of Wales that 7 families in Wales have lost immediate family members in Palestine, some having lost children and grandchildren. We fear for the Israeli hostages in Gaza, among them British citizens. More will lose their lives, which is why Plaid Cymru has tabled a motion in the Senedd calling on the international community to seek an immediate ceasefire. In advocating humanitarian pauses, does he recognise that innocent non-combatants in Gaza will again be killed when pauses cease, and that the only way to achieve lasting peace is a ceasefire?
Minister.
Well, the honourable lady will have heard what I and indeed the front bench have said about ceasefires, but I want to say that the hearts of the whole House will go out to the 7 families, and maybe others too, in Wales who have lost family members.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The atrocities on the 7th of October were well planned, well resourced, and indeed Hamas, the terrorist group, stockpiled in advance, knowing what the response would be from Israel. Equally, at the same time, Hamas have been caught out, putting injured terrorists through the Rafah crossing into Egypt. Will my right friend assess the position of what Hamas should do now to release those resources they've stockpiled so that the humanitarian effort can go much wider than currently is the case?
Minister.
My honourable friend is right and knows a great deal about these issues, and he is right about the atrocities committed on October the 7th by Hamas. This was a pogrom. It was the worst loss of Jewish life at any time in one day since the Holocaust and since 1945. And one of the reasons why the Rafah crossing is so difficult is precisely because of the circumstances which he described, with the misuse of the rules by injured Hamas terrorists.
Nadia Whittam.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. According to Gaza's Ministry of Health, more than 10,000 people have been killed by Israeli forces in the past month. That's 1 of every 200 residents of Gaza. This doesn't include everyone who may have died due to lack of clean water or the collapse of the healthcare system after fuel was cut off. Mr. Deputy Speaker, how many more people must die before the government joins the UN Secretary-General, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders, Save the Children, Oxfam, and the UN General Assembly in calling for an immediate ceasefire?
Minister.
Well, once again, Mr. Deputy Speaker, she will have heard the views of both front benches on the issue of a ceasefire, but her comments underline the importance now of trying to achieve these humanitarian pauses so that help and succour can be brought to those who are suffering.
Vicky Ford.
Deputy Speaker, the loss of life in Israel and Palestine is beyond horror, and everybody wants it to stop. But the statement from Hamas that they will not stop until the people of Israel are annihilated is deeply chilling. In his statement, he mentioned radicalisation, and there is concern that the greater the loss of civilian life, the greater the risk of radicalisation. So can I also thank him for saying so clearly that Israel must take precautions to minimise civilian casualties. I would add that Israel needs to be seen to be taking such precautions. We've continually called for pausing in the fighting to let aid in and people out. What assessment has he made of the likelihood of such pauses actually happening?
Minister.
Well, I don't think I can give a running commentary on that, except to say that the sinews of everybody are bent towards achieving it. She makes a very good point that from all this death, destruction and killing, we must guard against the radicalisation of an entire new generation of young people. As I think President Biden said, it's very important that the lessons of 9/11 are properly learned.
David Linden.
Those of us who do support a ceasefire get the overwhelming message from both the government and the Labour front bench that somehow calling for a ceasefire is naive. So can I ask the Minister, does he think that the Pope is naive in calling for a ceasefire in Gaza?
Minister.
I've set out very clearly our understanding and our logic and the reasons why we, and not just we, but also the opposition front bench, have reached the conclusions that we have on a ceasefire, and I hope that at the very least he will reflect upon those.
Anthony Higginbotham.
Speaker, getting aid into Gaza is vital, and I welcome the Minister's statement about looking for additional border crossings. But what's more important is making sure that once aid is in Gaza, it gets to the people who need it most. Reports suggest that Hamas are hoarding more than 200,000 gallons of fuel. That is fuel that could be used for generators, to power hospitals, fuel that could be used for ambulances. So could I ask what the government's assessment is of Hamas's holding of fuel and what steps we're taking to make sure that once aid gets into Gaza, it doesn't end up in the hands of Hamas?
Minister.
Well, he is right that we know that Hamas has hoarded fuel in Gaza. I can't give him a statistic. He himself gave one to the House. That may or may not be right, but we do know that they do have this stockpiling of fuel. And in terms of the way in which support will be used once we get these pauses and once we're able to get help and humanitarian supplies into Gaza, I can tell him that we are very, very careful indeed. We never work through the Palestinian Authority or through Hamas in terms of direct support. We only go through trusted organisations, and we are very careful indeed to ensure that we, as I set out in my statement, that the aid gets to those who need it and gets there directly.
Naz Shah.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the United Nations Secretary-General has said Gaza is resembling a graveyard for children. More than 4,000 have been killed since the start of this conflict. Every day we see footage of heartbreaking stories. I watched a small girl being pulled out of the rubble, asking her uncle if she was dead and whether he was taking her to a graveyard. Another video showed a girl, barely 5, stuck under a collapsed building, praying her final prayers in preparation for her death. Mr Deputy Speaker, children at their age should be not asking whether they are going to a graveyard, but whether they're going to a playground or buying ice cream or doing the usual things, not going to a graveyard and preparing for their death. Children outside Al-Shifa Hospital yesterday felt they needed to do a press conference to call on the world to let them live. So, Minister, when will the UK ramp up its effort to end the bloodshed and ensure Palestinian children just have the right to live?
Minister.
The Honourable Lady speaks with the greatest possible eloquence, and she speaks for the whole House in saying that what is happening to children in Gaza appalls us all. I just ask her to consider the wider context and accept that the government understands and agrees with her analysis of the plight of children in Gaza and will do everything within the wider context to try and bring that to an end.
Lick Drummond.
Mr Deputy Speaker, can I refer members to my register of interest concerning my visit to Israel and Palestine in May this year? I received a report from a surgeon at a hospital in Gaza today. He says the situation is beyond catastrophic. We're seeing horrific injuries and the majority are children. The type of injuries we are seeing is not something a human mind can accept or tolerate. People being pulled live from the rubble are scratched and bleeding and full of flies. A lot of his report's very graphic, including the fact that many children have lost limbs and no one knows who many of them are. Now, the UK is the penholder for the protection of civilians in conflict at the UN Security Council. Can we ensure that all health facilities, including the Indonesian hospital in Gaza, which apparently was at threat at being bombed, be protected from attack?
Minister.
She's entirely right to refer to the UK role at the United Nations, and we take those responsibilities extremely seriously, and our brilliant team who work at the UN are doing everything to justify the fact that we hold that particular pen among any others. And in terms of the treatment of hospitals, she will have heard what the Prime Minister has said about that, and we will continue to do everything we can to protect them.
Ben Bradshaw.
I welcome the balance and tone of the Minister's statement. When the government makes representations to the Israeli government about the increase in settler violence in the West Bank, what does the Israeli government say in return?
Minister.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, these are ongoing discussions and they are made at many levels. The Prime Minister has spoken repeatedly to Prime Minister Netanyahu. My colleague, the Noble Lord Ahmed, has been consistently in the region, and the Foreign Secretary likewise. So we are having those discussions at every level, but he may rest assured that what the Prime Minister has said, what I have said from the dispatch box, that is the thrust of these discussions, and we're doing everything we possibly can to drive forward what he and I both share as the right answer to this.
Nikki Akin.
Mr Deputy Speaker, it is incredibly difficult to hear the testimonies of the survivors of the 7th of October Hamas atrocities, and it is equally difficult to see the media reports of what is happening in Gaza, and particularly the children that are being affected. It is so important that we do all we can to bring this conflict to an end for the security and the futures of children in both Israel and in Gaza. I welcome the extra humanitarian aid that is going into Gaza from the UK government. Can the Minister please assure us that once this conflict is over and an even bigger humanitarian aid will be required, that the government will do all it can to help rebuild Gaza?
Minister.
Well, on her final point, there is no doubt that when peace comes and the international community is able to engage in a political process, the rebuilding of Gaza will certainly be part of that. And to her point about the awful testimonies of survivors from the 7th of October, and indeed the dreadful scenes we see on our television, thanks to the brave reportage of many journalists, there is no doubt that it is extremely difficult to watch, and that is why the government, along with our allies and others who are deeply concerned about this, are doing everything they can to ensure that we bring it to a close as soon as we can.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Deputy Speaker, 1,400 dead in Israel, 10,000 dead in Gaza, increased military activity on the West Bank, increased settler violence, and now more and more children dying as this conflict goes on in Gaza. And Prime Minister Netanyahu now promising that Israel will control the Gaza Strip in the indefinite future. Isn't it time the British government joined with all those other sensible, reasonable voices around the world that are doing everything they can to demand and get a ceasefire to prevent any further loss of life and begin to work out a peaceful future for all of the people in the region?
Minister.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman will have heard what his successor as the leader of the Labour Party has said on the subject of ceasefire, and we agree with what the Leader of the Opposition has said about that. But he describes an extraordinarily difficult situation, and he also talks about security on the West Bank. I think the issue of security on the West Bank, the key purpose for Israel is that the rockets cannot come over the border again. And I think you need to see security in that context rather than in the ebb and flow of the debate that's going on at the moment.
Sarah Bickliffe.
We know that escalation is a real risk.
And with reports that Israeli forces have started raiding refugee camps in the West Bank, we know there's a real risk to innocent Palestinians. There are also reports of Israeli settlers in the West Bank becoming increasingly hostile in the occupied Palestinian territories. Can the Minister please explain what specific steps he's taken to de-escalate these situations?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend makes the point that escalation is not just about the region, it's also about the West Bank as well. And that's why the Prime Minister has condemned settler violence and why we continue to make representations to the Israeli government in that respect.
Mike Amesbury.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. On the question of humanitarian pauses, what's the Minister's assessment? How long would they last? How would people be protected? How would it be managed? I think the Minister referred briefly to that in his statement. Yeah.
Well, the aim, Mr Deputy Speaker, of humanitarian pauses is not only to get humanitarian relief and supplies into Gaza, it's also to ensure that there's a safe structure, as I said earlier in my statement, to deliver humanitarian supplies, and one that does not put people in jeopardy. And therefore, a humanitarian pause should not be seen as one on its own. We are looking at negotiating a series of humanitarian pauses so that there can be a proper supply basis for the people we are trying to help.
French. Bob Butler.
Deputy Speaker, many constituents have raised concerns with me about the humanitarian crisis faced by Palestinians in Gaza. Indeed, a march was held in Aylesbury on Saturday, which I'm pleased to say passed off peacefully. We know that Hamas hides behind human shields, including, shockingly, even in hospitals. So how is my right honourable friend's department working with partners on the ground in Gaza to ensure the aid does get to those who need it, including in hospitals, despite the barbarity and the barriers put in their place by Hamas?
Minister.
My honourable friend is quite right to raise the importance of ensuring that Hamas brutality does not fetter our ability to get aid through to those who really need it. And I can give him that undertaking, that is precisely what we're trying to do.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you very much. Against the backdrop of a child dying every 10 minutes in Gaza and evidence that water entering as aid through the Rafah crossing is not being allowed into northern Gaza, will the Minister confirm the government supports the independence of the International Criminal Court and recognises its jurisdiction to address the conduct of all parties in the conflict in Gaza?
Minister.
Well, I thank her for her comments about the importance of prioritising children, and in respect of the International Criminal Court, she will know that the government is a very strong supporter of the International Criminal Court and the role that it plays in international affairs.
Heather Wheeler.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for his statement, and I agree with every single word of it. In 13 years of being an MP, I have never received such detailed and harrowing letters from my Jewish community and from my Muslim community in South Derbyshire. Whatever else happens, please can we make sure that looking to the future, we work on the two-states solution and we make sure that there is a safe place for all Gazans and all Jewish families going forward.
Minister.
My honourable friend accurately summarises the role and the importance that the government's attached to progressing the political process, and I thank her for her comments in that respect.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Sir Roger. Could the Minister tell us whether his discussions with charities and NGOs this morning included aid agencies like Oxfam, Christian Aid or Save the Children, who say that only a full ceasefire can deliver the conditions to get life-saving food and fuel and water and medicine into Gaza, not least because critical infrastructure like roads and hospitals need to be mended first. And this can't happen if they only have humanitarian pauses. I know he said a lot this afternoon about the difference between pauses and a ceasefire, but he's not addressed explicitly the advice that we're hearing from humanitarian experts on the ground who say that it is only a full ceasefire that will allow them to get that kind of aid to the people who need it fast enough.
Minister.
The Honourable Lady is correct about the importance of tackling the deficiencies of infrastructure, both in the area around Rafah, but more extensively than that. She asks about my contact with NGOs and charities. As she said, I had a meeting this morning which was chaired by Bond, which, as she will know, is the collective of these charities. We operate through trusted partners. We're operating through UNICEF, through UNRWA, through UN OCHA. We're in continual contact. And the point she makes about infrastructure is one that we are very much aware of and will do everything we can to assist with.
James Morris.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Minister is absolutely right to say that Hamas made a massive strategic error when they attacked innocent Israeli people on the 7th of October, and they're paying a heavy price with the destruction of their terror network in the Gaza Strip. But would he agree with me that the bigger price that they should pay is that the moderate voices on both sides should come together to re-establish the framework which was in place, as he referred to it, under Oslo, to come towards a two-state solution between a viable Israeli state and a viable Palestinian state, and we get the terror network out of the way?
Minister.
Not just in Britain, but all around the Arab world, all around the United Nations, people are very much focused on how you get a political track going again when these dreadful events draw to a close. And as I said earlier on, I think the one opportunity that may arise from these dreadful events is to try and rebuild the political process to deliver an answer on, he mentions the two-state solution, and that is the bedrock of British government policy, but to address the way we go forward politically.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I spoke to my constituent last night who's studying in York. He has lost 42 members of his wider family, and his immediate family remain in the line of rockets in Gaza. What steps is the government taking to ensure that there can be family reunion and that we can see refugees coming from the Gaza Strip to the UK?
Minister.
Well, we are working very hard to ensure that families are not broken up through the Rafah crossing. We have been moderately successful at that so far. So I am sure that everything that can be done will be done. And of course, if any of her constituents are caught up in that way, I hope that she will let us in the Crisis Centre know through the MP hotline.
Mark Logan.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'd just first of all like to put on record my thanks to the Bolton Council of Mosques in Bolton North East and across the town, which covers 34 mosques in the constituency and 60,000 members in Bolton. My constituents have felt very aggrieved over the last month. We've seen statements coming out of Israel around giving security responsibility for Gaza for an indefinite period of time. The Minister did mention that Secretary of State Antony Blinken had said that there shall be no Israeli reoccupation at Gaza after the war. So first of all, what is our government's position on this in the long term? Secondly, my constituents through the Bolton Council of Mosque have called repeatedly for ceasefires. I will be meeting them again tomorrow night. I would just like to see from our government's perspective what criteria would have to be met in order for us to call for a ceasefire.
Minister.
My honourable friend, I know, has been in detail deeply engaged in representing his constituents, and I'm aware of the representations he has made. I hope he will explain to his constituents tomorrow night the reasons why a ceasefire is not something which either the government or the opposition are calling for. And I hope that he will be able to explain, when it comes to the issue of pauses, that we are doing everything we can to both construct a scenario where there can be a number of pauses, but also to make sure that the humanitarian support can be safely delivered within Gaza.
Ansel Khan.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the international